Thank you very much, Tess. Thank you to TechUK for facilitating this and hosting us today. Before I start, a quick question. Who of you works for or represents an SME? Okay, and who of those who work for an SME uses generative AI? Okay, so I would say that's a majority of the room, which is nice. So what we are going to talk about today is the question of how to make use of generative AI in SMEs and what are the specific challenges of doing this responsibly and what sort of support can be offered to SMEs. To set the scene, there's a lot of rhetoric around what generative AI is going to do to us, and you see the 400 billion that the government thinks we may be saving up until 2030 by using generative AI for productivity. Now, whether you believe that or not, there's probably some benefit, financial benefit, and other types of benefits to be had. And the government very clearly recognizes that this is something that SMEs are involved in, and that they raise particular challenges, have particular issues that they need to overcome. So that's the motivation for us looking into generative AI for SMEs. So what are those challenges? What are the things that SMEs encounter? Many of these are not SME specific, but they are often more significant for SMEs. So you typically, as a company, if you want to use a chatbot sort of thing, you don't have control over the technology. You have to use something that's already there. The environment changes very quickly. That refers both to the ethical aspects, it refers also to the regulatory aspects, and also to the technology itself. So everything changes very quickly, the capabilities change, how we're supposed to deal with them. And that is something that's not unique to SMEs, but SMEs often find it more difficult to deal with that because they haven't got a specialist department, they haven't got the expertise in-house to understand what exactly those changes entail and mean for them. So this is where the RAISE project came in. RAISE stands for Responsible Generative AI for SMEs in the UK and Africa. So what we were trying to do in the project is to develop actionable guidance for SMEs. And the project is funded by RAI UK, so that's Responsible AI UK, which is a big program, which in turn is funded by UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. So the money comes from the government in the end. One of the specific aspects of this project that we found very interesting, and we hope that you find interesting as well, is that we looked not just at the UK, but we looked at a comparison between the UK and Africa. So we tried to get an understanding of how generative AI is used and what challenges people encounter in very different cultural contexts. And then we aimed to co-develop practical guidance, stuff that makes sense to people and that they can use. So this is the RAISE team. Most of us are in the room. It was led by the University of Nottingham and in collaboration with Trilateral Research. So you'll probably recognize some of us here, and if you want to have a chat afterwards, there are plenty of us around. Now, in addition to the practical challenge that I've just outlined, one aspect that I find personally interesting about the whole question of responsible AI is the intellectual framing. So my argument here is the responsible AI, that's what RAI stands for, is not a fixed, it's not a given thing. It's not something that we can rely on and clearly recognize, but it is something that's contested, that changes over time. What counts as reliable, as responsible in a particular context may not count as responsible in another one. One of the ways of thinking about this is to use the ecosystems metaphor. You will probably have come across that. The government likes to talk about the AI ecosystem. And what I think one can say about responsible AI is that it's not something that sits in the tech. It's not a piece of software or a piece of hardware. It's also not something that sits in the organization or the organizational use. But to a significant extent, I would argue that responsibility in AI sits in the ecosystem. So what counts as responsible has something to do with the socioeconomic, with the legal, with the general ecosystem in which the AI is used. Now that raises a lot of intellectual questions, some of which we've tried to address or are still trying to address through this project. One question, especially with regards to translation into practice, is how can you govern an ecosystem in a way that is responsible. So what can you do? What are the mechanisms within such a system that you can change in order to make it more responsible? This here is an attempt to give you a flavor for what a system looks like. So this is an attempt to draw a systems map of one of the case studies, and Pascal is going to talk about those case studies in a lot more detail in a minute. So what we try to do here is identify who are the key stakeholders, what are the key components, and how do they hang together. And one of the things that I realize you can't read any of the detail, and this is not about the detail. This is about demonstrating the complex relationships between the different bits and bobs. One of the things that this means is that you can't just have a simple linear intervention that will have clearly predictable consequences. Classical systems theory, but how do we deal with this? So we set out to develop a set of guidelines in the RACE project. And you may ask the question quite justifiably, well, do we need another one? No, there are hundreds, if not thousands of guidelines. So what is it that is novel here? What we've tried to do, and we are still trying to do, is to do something that's specific to SMEs. That means that we do not expect there to be a high level of expertise in any of the individual aspects. So we don't assume there's a legal department, there's a corporate social responsibility department, whatever. We are trying to do something that is based on our understanding of the practices of the SMEs that we've looked at in the case studies, and that is therefore context sensitive. The logic of the project was that we wanted to out by proposing a set of guidelines. So these were written by us, by the members of the consortium. And we then used these guidelines to interact with SMEs throughout the lifetime of the case studies. So the guidelines that you see here are fairly straightforward, are informed by a lot of other stuff that's out there. So we try to identify opportunities. Then we translated what we perceive to be the responsibility-related questions into risks, because we assume that that is a language that companies understand. And then we thought about how can you mitigate those risks, and how can you do this through the lifetime or the life cycle of a project. So this is what we started with. And the idea was that we were going to use this as a starting point to then iterate with the SMEs throughout our research to find out what actually works for them and whether any of this works for them at all. In practice, what we've done in the project is we've looked at 12 different case studies, 5 of those in Africa, 7 in the UK. We then did a set of workshops, some of them with the broader community, one specifically just with members of the case studies. And the idea was to develop a set of requirements that would help SMEs to deal with those issues. So this map gives you an indication not just of the geographical spread of what we've done, but also of the topic areas that we've covered. And if you look at this, you will see that we have a very broad range of application areas of generative AI. They range from legal AI to the use of generative AI for the provision of art, to financial services, to healthcare, to education, to consultancy. So the point here is that we've got a pretty broad range of insights into what happens out there in practice. What does this tell us? What did the SMEs think about generative AI and the issues that it raises? The main point in this slide is that we recognize that our framing of the topic area didn't resonate with the SMEs. So we came at this as researchers interested in the ethics and responsibility aspects of AI, and it turns out that this is not the way in which our respondent thought about it in general terms. So the SMEs that we interacted with very much focused on the particular challenges they face. And these are typical SMEs. Now, on the one hand, they want to survive, they need money. But then they have all sorts of other challenges around getting the operation up and running, about finding talent, technical challenges of setting stuff up, broader socioeconomic challenges. And the ethical and responsibility aspects of that are sort of distributed across that. So our initial framing didn't really work particularly well, and we had to find ways of translating it. We tried to then figure out what is it that the SMEs can actually deal with? What is it that would help them? And this is sort of a high-level set of requirements for the tools that we want to develop. On the one hand, they need to be context-specific. So it's not good to just say generative AI may have bias. Yes, we know that. But what? Now, in what context does bias in legal environments look like the same as bias in arts, whatever? It's supposed to be applicable, so practical, something that you can actually do stuff with, and they wanted it to be interactive. So what we're trying to do, and Pascal is going to explain that in a lot more detail, is to develop a tool that will help SMEs identify the main risks that they face, do a self-assessment of those risks, which will help us to rank them, and then that risk ranking will be used to develop a to-do list. So you go through a bunch of questions, and at the end you get a list of these are the main risks that you, in your context, probably should worry about. On top of that, we then want to provide guidance as to how can you actually deal with those. So we want to have a specific and tailored set of recommendations that the companies can work with. This is a first step at trying to translate these ideas into practice. So we want to start out with understanding, or we need to start out with understanding what the SME actually is and does. If we want to be context specific, we need to understand the context. So the parts on the left are the sort of questions we would start out with. So we need to understand who's the user, what do they know, what is their experience, what is their background, what project are they going to use it for? So what is the application area? Where is it located? This is where our difference between the UK and Africa comes in. Who are the customers and so on? We need to understand what sort of technology they are looking at and what sort of organization they are. Again, the size of the company makes a big difference, whether it's for profit or non-profit and so on. So this triggers a set of what we call screening questions, which will allow us to identify what likely risks are to be expected to arise. And we then use that to offer a self-assessment by the SME to think through the risks that we've identified. The self-assessment will allow for the ranking of the risks from these are the things that you really need to worry about to these are nice to have, which will then trigger this to-do list, which will include a set of pointers to ways of mitigating them. So these may be guidances, but there may be existing standards, there may be training, there may be consultancy, whatever else is out there. So that's the idea. So it was really a process that will help an SME to reflect on specifically their position and what the issues are that they are likely to face.